today we're going to cover spring preload and how you set it and why you need it. So starting out here, we've got our Fox coilover with pack springs. You can see that everything's installed, shocks at full extension, and our nuts are up here at the top loose. And so to set your preload, we're literally just going to screw this one down until it touches the springs. You can see right now they're rattling. And then when we have zero preload, it's just tight and the springs aren't rattling anymore. So right there, there we go, no more rattle. So that's zero preload, and what we'll do is we will measure the amount of threads, but that's just as a reference. So this is, this measurement is your zero preload, and every inch that you thread this nut down is 1 more inch of preload. If you have a solid axle vehicle with the shocks mounted on the axle and your motion ratio is 1:1, every inch you thread this down is going to give you 1 more inch of ride height. And if you have a 2:1 motion ratio like an A-arm, every inch you thread this down is going to give you 2 inches of ride height. And so that's really important to keep track of your preload and your ride height, because if your springs aren't correct, we're going to want to know those numbers so we can figure out what springs you should have. So moving on now, we're going to talk about why preload is important and how much you want. So preload gives you traction and it also makes the ride more comfortable. And we're going to show you why that is and how it works. And then also we're going to cover some of the basics of why people say that springs just hold the vehicle up, and we'll show you that's true in some cases and not in others. So our graph here is going to kind of explain everything. Here we have the spring force, and here we have inches of droop. So we're not looking at what happens at all when the spring compresses, just when it extends. So we have a 1,000-pound vehicle. It's compressed the springs varying amounts here to achieve ride height. So this is ride height, 1,000 pounds. And so the first 2 lines here are a vehicle with 6 inches of droop. And the first lower line here is with 0 preload. And the next line here is with 3 inches of preload. And so what we can see happens here on a short travel setup is that when the suspension is extended 5 inches, so there's 1 more inch of droop to go. When we have 0 preload, we have 167 pounds of spring force pushing that axle down. And so that's making the suspension droop and follow the terrain of the road. Whereas if we have 3 inches of preload, we have 444 pounds pushing that axle and tire down. So you can see it's going to follow the road much better when you have preload. And so that's what's going to give you that traction. So when you're articulated, you now have almost 300 pounds more force pushing that tire down, giving you traction. At the same time, if you're going faster, set of whoops or washboard or anything like that, your tire is going to follow the road and it's going to be a smoother ride. And so that's why on these short travel setups your preload really matters, is you get this extra spring force pushing the tire down. And now if we look at a long travel setup, which is sort of where that the saying that your springs just hold the vehicle up, that's kind of where it came from, is these longer travel setups. And you can see, whereas this is a 15-inch travel, 15 inches of droop, and this is 0 preload again, and then this is 3 inches of preload. And you can see here that at 5 inches of droop, we have 667 pounds versus 722 pounds. So the difference is much smaller when you have a ton of droop. And so that's why the difference between 0 preload and 3 inches of preload doesn't make as much of a difference on really long travel setups. And that's sort of where the terminology came from, is in testing they just didn't notice this difference here. And so preload is more important on shorter travel setups. You can see with 6 inches of droop, it's a huge difference. You start getting down to 2 or 3 inches of droop and it makes a much bigger difference again. So that's the basics of why preload matters. It is for the traction and the comfort. You can't have too much preload. If you get, the springs work in both compression and extension, and here we've analyzed extension to make the whole point about the purpose of preload. But if you have too much, it makes your springs just too soft, and then we have to compensate with valving, and then you can get some harshness. So there's a very fine balance that we want between spring rate and preload and valving. But in general, in the front of a vehicle, you want to start with about 1 inch of preload, and in the rear, you want to start with about 2 inches of preload. And that's for a general purpose coilover like we have here. If you have a specific application, sometimes with different shocks, we might run more preload or less preload. It sort of depends on what you're doing. So give us a call if you have questions. We're happy to set you up. But this is a basic overview of preload. Check out the article on our website, AccuTuneOffroad.com, and check us out on Instagram and Facebook. Thank you.